It's not customers' confidence in you that matters as a thought leader, as a trusted advisor, as someone smart saying smart things. It's actually customers' confidence in themselves. Have I asked the right questions? Have I done sufficient research? Have I thoroughly looked at alternatives? Not am I buying the right thing, but am I even following the right path?
The opportunity that we see to overcome this indecision challenge is how do we build that confidence in making that decision? And that's all context dependent. That's all the buyer in their own organization navigating not only the processes, but the potential consensus challenges across that buying group, both the ones that are visible and invisible from a seller's perspective.
14 years ago, a book forever changed the way salespeople and sales managers sold complex offerings to other companies. That book was The Challenger Sale by Matthew Dixon and Brent Adamson. The authors and their research team had studied more than 6,000 salespeople at more than 90 companies and across industries to better understand what characterized the most effective salespeople. Well, Brent is now publishing his third book, and this time it's with another colleague from his CEB and Gartner days, Karl Schmidt. Their book is titled The Framemaking Sale, and I believe it could have as much impact as the Challenger Sale did a decade ago. Their core premise is that in a world in which customers are barraged with insights, especially now from generative AI software, salespeople need to do far more than simply deliver unique insights. As Adamson and Schmidt say, salespeople need to help buyers feel more confident in how they make their purchase decisions, and that the way to do that is through what they call frame-making, essentially teaching buyers how to think about how they make major purchase decisions. Great to have you, Brent and Karl, on our podcast. Brent, we've talked before, and I can tell you were one of our most popular guests. So, Karl, you are new to Everything Thought Leadership. You guys are publishing a book next month. Here we're at the end of August, next month. And it's a great book. I've read a preview copy that you sent me. And why don't we talk about the genesis of this book, why you two decided to write it, the big need in the market that you are trying to fill, and how you work together to develop the book content.
Karl, I'll let you take this only because we were asked this question last week at a workshop we're running, Bob, in California. And I started the answer with when I was young, and Karl interrupted me. So Karl, Karl's got the shorter version, but it's a good one.
Real brief, Bob. Brent, I think, had the ideas for what this book turned into, rattling around in his head after, for many years of doing research into B2B buying as well as marketing. And as he was thinking about turning that from what had proven to be a very successful and influential keynote that he'd been doing around the world, turning a 75-minute keynote into a 300-page book that really pushes and pressure tests the ideas, is when he asked me to get involved with him. But that's the part that I was so happy to get. Again, Brent and I working together over many years, but the chance to really get after these very hard questions as to why buyers are struggling so much, and why you so often now hear of deals that are just win-win, right? That, the buyer is convinced of the value of the solution the supplier can provide. The ROI is compelling. Everything seems to be aligning for the purchase to make sense. And the data we're seeing is roughly half of those deals still end up dying to no decision. And the question is, of course, well, why is this happening? But then more importantly, what can we do about it? Again, all of this, Brent was kind of on this journey and said, hey, Karl, really could use your help thinking all this through and turning it into something that really can change the world. And so that's how he convinced me to go along on this ride with him. So is that fair, Brent?
With deep regret. No, not at all. But, in some ways, Bob, I think the answer is something you'll deeply appreciate, which is, all those years of doing research at CEB, at Gartner, at companies that, Karl and I that have been out of Gartner for a while now, we've had different paths, but over that course of time, we've been involved with lots of researchers gathering lots of data. And so we had lots of data points, all publicly accessible. And, but that's all it was a big pile of really interesting, compelling data. The thing to where you live and breathe, this world of thought leadership, isn't really about generating research for the sake of research. As I know I'm speaking to the choir on this, but I think it's three things. The first thing is lateral thinking, right? So over time, as these, you start connecting, like, well, we found this here, but we found this something else here. And I just talked to a head of sales. We've talked to heads of sales and marketing as our target audience. And they're saying this. And by the way, I talked to a buyer and they said that. And all of a sudden it starts to just organically, and sometimes you have to kind of force fit it. And so sometimes you make it happen. Sometimes it happens while you're walking your dog, but things start to coalesce, right? Around I see how these things connect. And then you start naming. I think naming is one of the key to your audience in thought leadership. The single most powerful thing that you do in thought leadership is probably giving something a name. And there's a whole podcast you and I could do about that I think is super interesting. But I can tell you exactly where I was. I was out walking the dog just up the block here. And I was thinking to myself, so much about Challenger is about frame breaking and trying to help customers think differently about their business. And it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, oh, everything we're talking about now is about frame making. And it's like, once you get these, like, sort of these, what I call binary, pairs, right? Frame breaking, frame making, they kind of sound fun together. It's like they actually work linguistically. They have a good rhythm to them. Literally, I think at this level, then you can start to build the narrative structure. It's like, what's the story, not the data, but what's the story? What's the wrapper around the data that makes it compelling? And that's what I've been working on out walking the dog, which, by the way, is the single best place to do thought leadership storytelling is when you're walking the dog, or not, essentially when you're not doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing. And this is what drives Karl nuts because, it always seems like I'm never working, which frankly, half the time I'm not. But the other half is I'm letting my mind do this work and run these systems in the background. And that's where I realized, I went out, started presenting it, became something clearly very resonant, very important. Customers were like, no one's talking like this. And that's when I pulled in Karl.
And you guys go back a long time then, right?
We do.
You were both at CEB, and then, when CEB was bought by Gartner in, 2016? It seems to me the core idea of the book is that business-to-business buyers are struggling mightily to buy complex offerings, whether it's consulting services, Accentures of the world, or technology, or other things. And that salespeople have an opportunity if they can help the buyer frame, to use your words, frame the decision better to help the buyer become a more sophisticated buyer or solver, I guess, of the problem that they may come to your company to solve in part. Would that be a fair way of summarizing the book?
Yes. Yes, and I guess would be the answer. So I think where buyers really struggle today is not just buying, it's deciding. So we call this dimension decision confidence. And one of the reasons why we're studying this is because we know from our data, which I think you and I talked about last time, Bob, is the single biggest opportunity or the single biggest driver of a high quality, low regret deal by far, at least increasing the likelihood of a high quality, low regret purchase where customers buy the bigger solution with the broader scope, is the degree to which they report a high level of confidence in the decision they're making on behalf of their company. And I'm going to cut the story a little short here, but what's interesting about this idea of decision confidence when you unpack it with the data is you find it's not customers' confidence in you that matters as a thought leader, as a trusted advisor, as someone smart saying smart things, as great products, great people. It's actually customers' confidence in themselves. Have I asked the right questions? Have I done sufficient research? Have I thoroughly looked at alternatives? Am I just making, not am I buying the right thing, but am I even following the right path? Am I even thinking the problem the right way? I mean, there's layer after layer after layer of sort of dimensions along which you could say, I don't know. And so, and what's really interesting, you get to the end of that, Bob, and I might think, you're amazing. I love your product. I love your solution. There's no doubt in my mind. I am 100% confident you're better than the competition. But if I've got all those other dimensions of lack of confidence stacked on top of it around, I don't even know if I'm even asking the right question. It almost doesn't matter that I think you're better, but I think you're better around a problem I'm not sure I'm supposed to solve. And you wind up being your customer's number one solution to their number three problem. And that's when they say, we need to look at this longer, or we decide to go in a different direction. And so frame making is all about, how do I help customers feel more confident, not in us, the supplier? How do I help them feel more confident in themselves, their self-perception rather than their supplier perception, which really nobody's talking about in B2B.
And is that because most salespeople don't look at it as their job to help the customer, figure out the basis on which they should buy, much less figure out how to crack the problem that some product or service is going to help solve?
Karl?
Yeah, I think there is an aspect of what sales sees as their role. And that's actually a big part of the book, because at the core of what we talk about is this question of what is the role of sales, especially in light of the emergence of AI. The conclusion we've come to is really there does need to be a fundamental mindset shift. And so what we describe as the frame-making mindset is to help the customer make the best decision they can in as little time as possible. And so again, that is significantly different from how so many sellers would have seen their responsibilities in the past. And we'll get into this, I think, a little bit more throughout this conversation. But if we think about it, it's less about, and again, it's still necessary for us to identify that fit of value, right? And again, so much thought leadership is kind of geared towards that question. But the opportunity that we see to overcome this indecision challenge is how do we build that confidence in making that decision? And that's all context dependent. That's all the buyer in their own organization navigating not only the processes, but the potential consensus challenges across that buying group, both the ones that are visible and invisible from a seller's perspective. And so again, it's a shift. Is it entirely dissimilar from what the best sellers are doing today? Of course not, right? I mean, the sellers that are really crushing it in this environment are the ones that appreciate that these are the challenges the customer needs to overcome to not just buy from me, but to make a decision on what's best to buy at all. And so at that level, is it fundamentally different? Maybe for many, but as we saw in these workshops we were doing last week in this large tech company in California, sellers, there was an initial bit of skepticism, but as they began to appreciate the power and reflect on the struggles their customers are facing as they try and buy, they're like, absolutely, this is exactly what we need. This is the right time and what we need to do to be successful going forward.
Are there some characteristics of the types of purchases you think Framemaking is particularly suited for? Whether it's large ticket or highly complex, lots of various solutions, vendors they could go to. Then I'm thinking about the decision about whether to buy generative AI, large company to buy generative AI tools, that there are lots of them now, and where to use it and where to not use it. And is there some characteristics of the purchases here that this would really be helpful for both the salesperson force and the customers?
Yeah, I think the answer, again, is sort of a yes and. It's a really interesting sort of answer. Is the book is written largely for large, complex B2B purchases, right? So whether it's capital equipment, consulting services, business services, IT, you name it. When you start getting into the challenges of customers, by the way, the reason why this whole idea of customers feeling more confident in the decisions they make is so important is because we think, Bob, where we are today, and just given our reality, is that there are 4 just really significant challenges that customers face in making those decisions. So that confidence is absolutely under threat or under pressure, undermined, whether it's decision complexity, which goes absolutely to your point about the size and scope of these decisions. There's information overload, which that one is interesting. We'll come back to that perhaps if you'd like, because that one plays across all levels of complexity of decisions. Certainly there's more information out there about complex CRM systems than there might be about a pair of socks. But I don't know if you bought a pair of socks lately, but you can go down a rabbit hole on a pair of socks for literally hours, if not days, right? So in decision complexity, information overload, objective misalignment, which is, again, this is really, we agree you're great, but we're not even sure we're confident or aligned with each other. So the more people you get involved, the more that becomes challenging. And then there's outcome uncertainty, which is also to your point about as these things become more complicated or complex, the implementation becomes that more uncertain. And that's where it's really interesting is it doesn't matter as a supplier if I show up and demonstrate to you all the amazing successes we've had at other companies. Oftentimes what we find is customers' reactions, no, I believe you. I 100% believe you that you got that amazing result at those 3 other companies, but we're different and we're going to find some way to screw this up. So it's, in other words, I don't doubt you. I doubt me. And so those are all true. I think especially true in large complex purchases. And that's where the book is geared. Karl would tell you, I know, because he and I have had long discussions about this, that even in quote unquote low involvement purchases, things that seem pretty simple, like say a pair of socks or a dog. The story I tell all the time is like buying a dongle on Amazon. Like I just need a dongle for USB-C because everything's USB-C now. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, Bob. Do you ever go on Amazon? And I won't do the whole story because there's like a 15-minute riff I do on this. But you find yourself thinking you're going to buy something relatively simple, and all of a sudden 3 hours later you're comparing dongles because one's got a 4.1 star rating, one's got a 4.12 star rating, and you get really frustrated. And the story always ends with this joke, but also true, which is, Amazon actually has a button that makes that pain go away. And that button's called Save for Later. And if you hit Save for Later, then you don't get to buy the dongle, but the pain stops. And you kind of hate yourself a little less for spending so much time buying a bleeping dongle. And it's absolutely true. My wife has 582 items saved for later on her Amazon account. And the reason why is because it's not about B2B buyers. It's about us as human beings. Is that some of us will gravitate in different contexts with something called satisficing, and others will gravitate towards something called maximizing. And this can be partly based on you as a person, partly based on the context, partly based on the stakes of the purchase. There's lots of different factors involved. Satisficing is I just buy good enough. I go, it's a dongle. I just like 5 seconds. How hard was that? And maximizer's like, I better look at this a little longer. And all of a sudden I'm 7 hours into dongle buying and I still haven't bought it and I save for later. And so all of these things, complexity of purchase, personality profile, the context of the purchase, the stakes, the number of people, all of these things play a role. And as a result, I think what's interesting is the exhaust of all that is that frame making can be incredibly valuable in sort of any kind of purchase where customers struggle to make a confident decision, but especially true for complex purchases.
Yeah. And one of the things I picked up from your book is this notion of the explosion of information. And you write about the explosion of quality thought leadership content, although I would argue with you on that. Surveys we've done of buyers, of executives who read thought leadership and use it to decide which firm to use or to put on the short list. Surveys we've done, in fact, we just did one of 200 executives who buy IT services. And Edelman PR and LinkedIn have done studies that all come to the same conclusion. Most readers, consumers, executive consumers of thought leadership think most of the content is not very good. Now, there's obviously been an explosion of content, but the bar quality, in my experience and from our research, is not getting much better. In many ways, it's gotten much worse because everybody thinks, well, now we need a thought leadership section on our website and we'll write some superficial white papers and we'll call that thought leadership and I'll get a promotion. So, and I'll put a head of thought leadership on my job title and that'll help me get promoted. So, or get me a job somewhere else because I'll be discoverable on LinkedIn for people who want heads of thought leadership. So our experience is that thought leadership content has not necessarily gotten better. In fact, I think in some cases it's gotten worse. There's no arguing, I think, that the amount of content has just exploded. And so dealing a lot more white papers on research reports, for that matter, on any topic, than they could easily get 10 years ago, even 5. And that's confused a lot of people.
Yeah, but I'd argue, and again, we've been looking at this for well over a decade. And so the challenge is that somewhat subjective evaluation of what is good, right? And I'm sure if we went back and looked at the things that we studied back 15 years ago versus today, then in terms of the sourcing, the insights, I think there has been objective improvements in terms of the quality of what's there, but at the same time, the bar just keeps rising, right? And so what might have been sufficient as a differentiated perspective with insight around in a thought leadership piece in 2010 versus 2025, night and day comparison. However, to your point, would someone reading something in 2025 be holding it to a 2010 standard? Of course not, right? They're going to be comparing it to everything else they read today. And that's where, again, the degree to whether it's, I know compelling is often the outcome variable that these studies look at. But regardless of what outcome variable you're looking at, in terms of whether it's something that's sufficiently distinctive, differentiated, that will then drive something leading to maybe preference or one of the more commercial outcomes that we all aspire to. That's something that, again, even the most recent study that Edelman published on this stuff, again, the thing that came out number one is an understanding of my business challenges, the context of what matters to me. And that's the thing that so often I would 100% agree that thought leadership today still often falls short because it's not appreciating the context of the person we're trying to influence, whether that's a buyer or when we look more broadly into corporate comms, and we studied this for years, where these questions of different audiences, whether it's an investor, a community member, a prospective or current employee, if we look at all those different stakeholders, then again, the dynamics fundamentally change, but it's all very personal to that audience and what they care about and what they need. And that's where, unfortunately, thought leadership so often is about building up the brand of the organization or the individual. And so it's all about, look at me, look at how smart I am, look at the ideas I have. This is why you want to pay attention, which again, in a consulting world, I worked for BCG, I worked for Deloitte back in the day. So again, that's a little bit of a different dynamic than a typical B2B. But what our research showed if you're a B2B seller of some, whatever the complex solution is you're selling, then how smart I am and how I'm perceived that way from a brand building perspective doesn't actually move the needle very much in terms of purchases, right? And so that's where, again, we often historically differentiated between thought leadership and commercial insight.
The term commercial insight needs some explaining here. It goes back to Brent and Karl's days at the corporate executive board around the concept of the challenger sale. A commercial insight is an idea or a finding that forces a customer to rethink a problem that they must solve and to consider a new solution that they might not have thought of before. Brent's research at Gartner back in 2018 found that sales reps who used those commercial insights to change the way a customer thinks about a problem had a 41% better chance of winning a high-quality sale. B2B salespeople should use commercial insights to help customers understand a problem that they had minimized or ignored.
Maybe, Brent, you would want to add a little bit to that part of this distinction, because it is important as we think about pulling apart that monster noun of thought leadership into the various purposes it can serve.
So Bob, at the risk of ticking off your audience, but hopefully getting them excited, I have thoughts here. What if your audience thought of themselves as not just thought leaders, but storytellers? And some of them are going to embrace it and say, heck yes. And some of them are going to say, heck no, because they see themselves as, like we do, we see ourselves as researchers. I'm a PhD. My PhD is linguistics and applied linguistics of all things in German, but the years, decades of being trained on all sorts of different research techniques. And so I get it. I want to have high, quote unquote, quality thought leadership that is good. But one of the things I learned, not as a researcher, but as a teacher, is that the quality of the ideas don't matter if you can't use them to move someone to action, if you can't get them to think and then ultimately act differently. And this is where I think a lot of us in the world of thought leadership really fall down, because it goes exactly to what Karl said, which is if customers saying, yeah, I don't see thought leadership as all, this particular example of thought leadership is all that good, it begs this really critical question, which is, what does good mean? And I think if you were to go back, just a bit of a hypothesis and be really interesting to test. If we're like, okay, when you say it wasn't good, what do you mean? And they'll probably say something like, I don't know, it just didn't kind of blow me away, or it just kind of sounded like everyone, or it just didn't move me to, you know what they're saying is, they're not going to say, I was a little, some of them might say, I was a little concerned about the sample size. So they might pick on the edges around methodology, and the really smart ones would probably do that. I would guess the vast majority aren't going to pick at the methodology or the sample size or the whatever. They're going to pick at like just the way it, not what it made them know or help them know, they're going to pick up the way it made them feel, or the lack of the way it made them feel. And I think this is the big opportunity in thought leadership, is the storytelling, the narrative component, which is, yes, you can have a great sample size. Yes, you can do great research. And yes, you can have logistic regression and gosh knows what else, right? But unless you can take the output of that research and wrap it into a story that isn't just designed to help someone know something, but designed to help someone feel something, your thought leadership will always be seen as falling short in the eyes of your customer, not because they don't think you're smart, because they'll probably think you're really, really smart, but they won't necessarily think they need to do something different. They won't feel more confident in their ability to do something different. Thought leadership, we always said, was thought leadership is all about helping customers feel that you're smart. Challenger was all about helping your customers feel like they're wrong. Framemaking is all about helping your customers feel like you can do this. So I'll stop there, because this is soapbox mom, and I apologize. I will completely geek out on this, but it's just, I would boil it down to, when you build your thought leadership, ask yourself, not just what do I want my customers to know, what do I want them to feel? Because otherwise you're just going to start, it's a difference in degree. You're going to start to more research, more data, more evidence, more story cases, more best practices. And you're going to solve for a difference in degree on knowing, as opposed to a difference in kind on feeling.
I largely agree with that. I mean, my experience, I define thought leadership differently than a lot of people.
You do.
I really do. And I look at it as a business strategy particularly for professional services firms. The thought leadership is the evidence that they get when they do research, develop a superior idea that turns into a service that they scale in terms of service delivery. In other words, thought leadership research turns into service innovation. Mm-hmm. And I happened to work for a consulting firm for 10 years that came up with the biggest management concept of the 90s, business re-engineering, that created a much bigger market for Deloitte and Accenture and others who could scale the quality of the re-engineering services that they delivered far better than the little firm that became a big firm. It became a firm that went to zero revenue 5 years after it peaked. So I equate thought leadership with service innovation. If you can't deliver on the promises that your best-selling book makes or your Harvard Business Review makes, article makes, if you can't deliver on that promise with a consistent level of service quality, then someone else is going to run away with the market.
Also true. Yeah.
And so Challenger sale, right? CEB wound up selling off the Challenger training practice.
Yep.
Yeah, CEB don't want to be in the training business. Or Gartner, we don't want to be in the training business. I don't know if the sale was before the Gartner acquisition, but
no, it's after Gartner. Yeah, this is exactly what Gartner bought CEB, looked at this, said, this isn't our business. Great business, just not our business. And so they spun it to an independent, and it's just recently been acquired by another training business, by the Richardson Group. John Elzey over there and the team were really smart. So it's Challenger as a body of IP has been on a bit of a journey in the last 10 years. Very interesting to watch.
My broader point is that I look at thought leadership as more kind of broader, as this is also service innovation and service excellence. And so part of service excellence is giving customers a way to take your big ideas and with or without you, implement them, right? To make your ideas practical, to make the Challenger sale approach to selling practical. So I bet you a lot of people who read your book never called CEB, never called you guys and said, this is great. I think we can do this ourselves. Now, whether they succeeded or not is a different issue, right? But in your book, you made it practical, right? You laid out, here's how you take a Challenger sale approach. And the second book, even more.
And then this third book, well, at least for me, the third book, Framemaking Sale, this is literally one of the number of reasons, one of the reasons why I invited Karl to come in. And thank God, Karl, you said yes, because that was our absolute mandate from the beginning. As you can tell, I've got some pretty big ideas based on this research that I wanted to share with the world, and Karl did too, was excited. But we have held ourselves accountable, and Karl's held me accountable too. Like, so brass tacks tactical. So every element of this book is, here's a big idea that hopefully changes your mind a little bit or gets you thinking. Here's what to do about it. Karl, this is, I think, in some ways, the thing I'm most excited about the book and the workshops now that we've created on the back end as well.
Yeah, and that's the piece. Having grown up in strategy consulting, then the ideas that you're talking about, Bob, are certainly you get that in front of someone, they're like, wow, I never thought of that, thought differently. But again, if that just becomes as far as it goes, then that ultimately doesn't have much of an impact, right? And so that's where for all of this, and historically when we worked together all those years at CEB, Brent emphasized previously kind of the storytelling aspect and how to make people have that emotional connection to actually motivate them to not just know, but to feel something. So they went out and actually did something, that know, feel, do frame. But beyond that, then there's the, well, what do I do, right? And so, and of course, without the storytelling, then the message would never be delivered, which is obviously going to be critical for the folks listening to this. But equally important, I would argue, in the 50 plus researchers that I would manage behind the scenes as the practice vice president, a huge amount of that was to identify what are the best practices that turn these insights that came from the primary research we were doing or the secondary, whatever the nature of the source of the insight was, into something that a head of marketing, a head of sales, a head of comms, whatever the functional lead was that we were working with, what did they practically do differently on Monday to take advantage of these new insights, right? And so that's the core of everything we were doing in Framemaking, is not just introduce the new insight, but how you could apply it, what you'd actually do differently as a head of sales, as a head of sales enablement, as a marketing leader, as a content marketer, whatever your role is, taking this new framing that was going to help the customer manage this complex decision in a way that made it that much more doable, but how we enable the sellers or the other parts of our commercial organization to then get that in front of the customer in a way that they can actually take advantage of it to make their life a little bit more easier and give them more confidence in that decision.
Yeah. And whether or not obviously you're trying to get the business, but some customers will say, this is a great way to think about this problem. Thank you, guys. I think we can handle this ourselves, right? You've really added value here because we were thinking it totally differently, and you've showed us a much better way to think about this complex issue.
And it's a bit of a dual-edged sword, right? So for the book to be of value and for it to take off and people to, we're not really trying to sell books, but we want to sell as many as we possibly can, but that's not the business model, right? But But the book has to stand alone to that point, Bob, which is, well, I read this book, great ideas. I can do something about this. I know what to do based on what I read. And then there's the flip side is at the same time, it's like, there's more here. There's more meat on this bone. I need to call these guys, which is, of course, where we're hoping to go. And with the workshops we've now developed, I think we're in a really great place to get there. At least it's the first step of getting there. But it's always interesting with thought leadership, isn't it? Because for your audience, you're trying to create thought leadership. You're trying to create thought leadership that creates a long-term connection and interaction with your audience. But for that to happen, there has to be an immediate payoff from the thought leadership in the moment, doesn't there? Of just like, I read it, that was really valuable. So it's kind of a tricky sort of thing to balance, isn't it?
Let's talk a little bit about generative AI here.
Okay.
The complexities or difficulties this is creating for chief sales officers. Have you heard of chief sales officers in clients or companies you've spoken with who are saying that customers are using ChatGPT or Anthropic or whatever to figure out what they should do, and we think we're not even being called? As a result, customers are using chat boxes to figure out how to solve the problem themselves or go to somebody else, and we're losing out on leads. Is that what you're hearing in the marketplace?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the exercises we had the folks do during the workshop this past week. Imagine you're your customer researching this key question that's going to drive the decision as to what the best solution is for you. Throw it into AI of your choice, whatever that might be, and see what the response is. And it was pretty revealing that the vast majority and we had sales leader, we had a whole range of different roles in this workshop, but very few of them had ever actually done that exercise to kind of walk that mile in their customer shoes. The one person who really stood out was the newest member to the organization, the person who is, more recently out of college, just had gotten hired. They're the one just kind of figuring it out for themselves. And so they had kind of done this a little bit more than anyone else had. But it was fascinating that the first thing they all cared about was, well, where does our company appear on the list of recommended alternatives from AI, right? And maybe not that surprising they went there first, but I think what many of them missed until we kind of walked them through the rest of the exercise is, well, think about where they might struggle with taking this response and then having it translate into confidence in their decision to progress their buying journey. And unfortunately, what we're seeing at this stage of the evolution of AI is it's, even if you put in a very specific prompt, just saying, what should I buy? It inevitably will lead to a variety of sources and a variety of additional questions you didn't know to consider on your own. And so getting into that satisfying, maximizing dynamic that Brent referred to earlier, it essentially drives so many of us to become even more of a maximizer than we might have been prone to otherwise, both because it's prompting you to consider more things, but also knowing so many decisions are a consensus across a buying group, and we fear the judgment of others, and we fear someone asking, oh, did you do enough research? Did you consider this, that, or the other? You don't want to be perceived as having not done sufficient due diligence. That just AI right now is more opening that window to more and more opportunity to maximize than necessarily simplifying for us, at least in this stage of its evolution. Now, of course, over time, this will change. But right now, we're finding it actually is exacerbating the problem more than being the silver bullet to cure it.
Karl and I've talked a lot about, came up again in a conversation with someone else this morning. Do you ever notice how you tweak one variable in your prompt and all of a sudden the output completely shifts? It's like, so you get this output, say, oh, I should buy this company. Okay, I feel really good. Let me just try it with this price point or this feature. All of a sudden it's like, no, you should buy it totally. Didn't you just tell me to buy what? And so at some point you become completely confused and overwhelmed. And what we're finding from personal experience, even, I've got this longer story I won't tell today unless you want to really hear it. It was about buying dog food. I tried to buy artisanal human grade dog food, used AI to build it, essentially an RFP. And at the end, it gave me a recommendation. And I looked at it and said, I guess. But you know what would be really helpful if I could just talk to somebody, talk to like other dog owners, other people, and get their experiences. And I think, at least for now, that's what AI doesn't offer. And the backdrop of this, I think, is so interesting and so important, Bob, is we opened the book in the introduction with the very last data point that I worked on at Gartner was this rep-free experience point, which has become really well known in B2B sales, which is one of the things we found is when we went and surveyed B2B buyers of complex deals, 75% of them told us if it were possible, they'd prefer to buy that solution without ever speaking to a seller at all. And that led to all sorts of debates about, well, at our company, you have no choice. We have to configure it. We have to build it together. So you have to talk to a seller. And that led to conversations around, yeah, but okay, that's what you have to do, but it's clearly not what customers want to do. So there's this gap between preference and reality and all these long debates and discussions around this. But what's interesting to me with this AI world that you're asking about now is one way or another, I think the point is the data says 75% of B2B buyers would prefer to buy a complex B2B solution without speaking in a rep-free experience. It doesn't, because we didn't ask, it doesn't necessarily in a human-free experience. In other words, I think that the challenge that customers have is not, I don't want to talk to you, Bob, because you're a human. I don't want to talk to you because you're a seller. And I worry about mixed incentives and all the kind of motivations. But if you could just help me sort this out, AI's made it worse, or at least made it more confusing. And so that's the question we're asking at the heart and soul of the Framemaking Sale. What would it take to be the one seller your customers do want to talk to? And I think that's the answer, is to be the one that shows up not as a seller, but as a human being that helps you feel better, not about the seller. If I can interact with you and as a result, I feel better about myself, that works in marriages and friendships too, I think, Bob. It's really powerful. It's human connection.
Who in B2B companies do you think, in addition to, of course, the chief sales officer, who plays roles in a frame-making sale? Does marketing have a role? Does market research within marketing or outside of marketing have a role? Thought leadership research?
I think the answer is yes. Karl, we've talked a lot about this, haven't we?
Yeah. So at the core of frame making is essentially the 3 E's. But the first is establish the frame. And that establishing the frame that the seller will use to help the customer overcome whatever the complexity is. Much like, the various framing, the famous, 5 forces. Again, anyone who's listening to this who's got some experience with the strategy consulting world will be familiar with the BCG growth share matrix. There's so many 2x2s in that world. But that type of framework often is necessary to support that customer with that framing. And if it's a maturity model, a process, whatever form that framework might take, the more complex or the more involved that framework is, the more the individual seller probably can't and maybe shouldn't be left to try and build it on their own. And so in those cases, absolutely, you need sales enablement, you need marketing, all those support entities help design that insight that's going to be the basis for the framing. However, at the other end of that continuum is the simple nudge, right? And so in some cases, if a seller's realized that what's really going to help this customer is to involve procurement earlier in the process, because they'll understand better what that buying journey needs to look like within their own company, then it can be what we refer to as framing without a framework, which often is just a suggestion. And those things sellers can very much do on their own. And so this continuum of the complexity of the framing very much dictates who else needs to be involved in the process. But for the most part, yes, absolutely, it's critical that marketing to have the real understanding of the scale of the customer needs and how to design something that actually supports that particular challenge. Sales enablement, the folks that would be building your ROI calculators. Again, there's so many of these enabling tools for this first E of frame making are absolutely critical. For completeness sake, the other 2 are then once you have that frame established, the second E is the engage, where that seller or whoever has the contact with the customer, with that main point of contact, then engages them with the framing. And then ultimately the third E is the execution of that framing across the buying group beyond the main over time until the journey is complete. And so again, yes, it takes a village, I guess is the short answer.
And on the second E, Bob, the engage, which is, so now that we've kind of designed this advice, this guidance, coaching in the form of either a formal framework or just advice, how do we get in front of our customer? Just the way we've written the book and how we think about it in our target audience is here's how sellers can do it. But sellers could be, I did a podcast yesterday purely for account managers, for existing customers. I kind of think of them as sellers or customer success. So then you get into sales engineers and value engineers and anyone who's in a customer facing role. But then you get into the fact that actually customers engage with us, not just through human channels, but digital channels, which is marketing. So not only I think is there a absolutely incredibly important role for all of these different back office functions to play, or other functions, I should say, to play in establishing the framing. I think it's also just mapping all the different touch points across which we engage our customers and thinking about how we can deploy a frame making approach in any and all of them. And the second to last chapter of the book We get into some really interesting details about different levels or kinds of framing to what we call just the facts versus more of subjective questions, whether they are better human-led or just here's the information. It gets a little subtle, but very much like Challenger, this will be very much a team sport to do it really, really well.
Let me give you a hypothetical example, maybe a real example based on companies you've talked to. It may be even a dangerous example to talk about. Let's say you're a big or mid-sized tech firm or tech services firm, and you don't like where you're appearing on Gartner's Magic Quadrant, right? You're in the lower left, okay? And you think it's unfair because you don't think Gartner has established all the right criteria, and that if you came up with a different frame, a different way for the customer to judge what kind of technology or tech services company they need to do the job, you'd come up with a whole different set of criteria that you actually think is better than Gartner's. And you're not doing this from the standpoint of, making sure of kind of bad-mouthing your competitors and showing you're the only one in this new quadrant. Would that be an example of where a tech services or tech company might want to apply your principles of frame making and say, listen, we need to show customers there's a different way of looking at this, solving the problem.
It's funny, Bob, there's actually an example that's very similar to this in the book from a company called Expedient, which we talk about. And there's a couple ways to look at this. So I love the fact you went to Gartner because Karl and I both being Gartner veterans, but I have no skin in the game when it comes to Magic Quadrants, one or another, but I've seen the very scenario you described play out, not surprisingly, right? And so you have one option. One option is we're going to come up with our own competing framework, right? And so don't look at the Magic Quadrant, don't look at the wave, look at our new dial-matic or what, I don't know. It's like look at our new framework, our maturity model. That's going to be really hard given the fact that Gartner's, particularly in IT, such a strong presence. At the very least, even if you could get the parity, which is very unlikely, you're never going to get people to stop looking at the Magic Quadrant, right? So I think this idea, there's one of these core principles we teach in frame making, which is when you're faced with a situation like that, often, certainly in sales, your natural reaction is to run away from it or react against it. And I think that would be marketing too. It's like go out and bash. Marketing wouldn't bash the Magic Quadrant. Sales might, but let me tell you why they got this completely wrong. Or they bash if not bash, at least sort of try to downplay it. Here's a totally different option, which is rather than running away from it, run right at it, right? And just acknowledge it. Say, you know what? If you haven't seen the Magic Quadrant yet, you want to take a look at this because it's actually really interesting. The way they're thinking about this challenge, the way they're thinking about this technology, I think is really fascinating. But in working with other companies like you, so I'm using social proof there. We call that the phrase that frames. One of the things that we've learned is that as powerful and as useful as this framework can be, notice I've given as much credit as I can. We find that given how fast the market is changing right now, there's a couple considerations that aren't fully baked in here that for at least some companies can really change the way they think about this. Here's a couple extra dimensions that really aren't fully incorporated here that probably worth considering. Now, I didn't say I've been doing this for 30 years. Here's what you need to do. I didn't show up as an expert because we know from data that actually does damage. Rather, what I've done is I've tried to take that framework and give you essentially guidance. I've framed the framework, right? I've given you guidance on how to think about that framework using what we call prompting and bounding. I've prompted you to think about two additional things that may not be in the framework, and I've bounded it to your focus, and I've used social proof to give me the credibility. I'm not saying this because it's my opinion and I hate Gartner or love Gartner or whatever. I'm saying other companies like you have experienced this. So now my role is not the expert, but the connector. There's like 7 different principles of frame making that I just packed into that one example. But I think the short answer is try to go head to head with like our framework versus your framework, steel cage match, particularly when you're working against a well-branded company like Gartner is probably, for most contexts at least, a losing battle.
And a company like Gartner who appears to be neutral.
Correct. Especially in that case. Yeah, that's right. And particularly if you're a supplier and you're perceived as not neutral, right? So you've got that working against you too. So to show up, say, don't look at that Magic Quadrant, look at our model instead, just good luck. It doesn't feel super effective. So don't run away from it, run right at it.
Karl, do you think the same way or similarly, which is, I guess what I'm hearing from Brent is don't badmouth the dominant frame, the dominant model. Show where it may not be incorporating some other considerations that the customer might find important or should find important.
That additional lens, right? It's the acknowledgement. That's where the Expedient story really highlights so well that in their market, IBM was the couldn't get fired by him from IBM. Obviously, was the story for so many years for so many buyers.
Expedient is a technology company founded in 2001 that has grown to 400 employees today and which provides cloud computing services. Expedient has 10 data centers across the U.S., and the firm focuses on 4 markets: healthcare, manufacturing, financial services, and retailing.
And Expedient had an option to either say, hey, everyone's looking at these couple of videos from IBM, right? And do we need to create our own videos? We need to create our own framing. It's like, no, what they chose to do instead is like, hey, if you haven't seen it, these 2 IBM videos actually do a really wonderful job of framing up a lot of the challenge you're facing. But as you watch them, keep in the back of your mind this 1 or 2 questions, right? And those 1 or 2 questions have to be the one that are what ultimately will differentiate IBM's solution from Expedient's, right? And so again, get back to the mindset we referenced earlier, the role of sales is to help the customer make the best decision they can. If there's 1 or 2 questions that will really help determine whether the best solution for that customer is Expedient or IBM or something else, the faster the seller can help that buyer recognize that's the important question to ask and get answered, then the sooner then the customer can determine, oh yeah, my best answer is Expedient, so we should be talking. Or maybe that best answer is IBM, in which case the seller goes, great, got to disqualify this opportunity. I can spend my time somewhere else, right? And so again, it just gets to that best answer that much sooner, which ultimately helps everyone.
Let's talk a little bit about Expedient, 2 or 3 minutes explaining that example, because that's a core example in your book. And I think a lot of people are going to be very interested in that. Briefly, they're a cloud services company. Say more about how they...
So Expedient it's a cloud services company in North America. Their headquarters are the interesting combination of Pittsburgh and Columbus, Ohio, I believe. The CEO at Expedient is a guy named Brian Smith. I've known Brian for a long time. I will tell you honestly, he's one of the smartest commercial leaders I've ever met. And that's not just blowing smoke. Brian's really impressive. And he used to be the head of sales. And so
now he's the CEO.
He used to be the head of sales. Now he's the CEO. And I've heard Brian say the very words that we've adapted to the frame-making mindset. I've heard him say to his sales force many times, he says, look, guys, we have one job. Our job is to help our customers make the best decision they can in as little time as possible. And I've heard him do this about 4 or 5 times, about different versions, whether it's a sales team or company-wide or things like that. And and it's really funny, Bob, because inevitably, it's almost like it's a plant. Maybe it is. I don't know. Inevitably, someone will ask the obvious question. It's like someone asked the question no one wants to ask, what everyone's thinking, right? It's like, hey, Brian, what happens if we do exactly what you're saying, which is we go out and help our customers make a great decision, then they choose the competition. And Brian, inevitably, and without missing a beat, and with full of confidence, will say, and conviction, will say, that's the second part of the idea, which is we want to help our customers make the best decision they can in as little time as possible. Because if I'm going to lose, I want to lose early. But it's not just that I want to lose early, it's the way I want to lose, which is I want to lose in the process of being helpful. Because if that's my posture and we lose, I hate losing. I hate it. And I don't want to lose. But if I'm going to lose, I'll lose early. But he said, I'll tell you something else. When it comes time for that customer to make the next decision, or maybe a different decision because that one didn't work out, I want to be the first person they call because they know that's how we show up. And if you show up in any other way, I think today, Bob, going back to our AI conversation, then I kind of don't need you, right? If you're going to show up in just a way to convince me you tell me about your features and benefits and all of your great smart stuff and all of your products and how they're better, I can already do that either on your website, hopefully, or using AI. I don't even need to go to your digital properties at all. So how are you different? How do I make this human interaction different? How do I make you as a human at this company versus all the humans at other companies different? And that's by showing up in this way that is specifically with the front foot fully, firmly planted on help. Make it easier, make me feel better about myself. And Brian is fully committed to that. And it's one of the many reasons why I respect the hell out of him.
I would think that's important posture for Brian to take, especially to overcome a prospect's view of, well, if they're trying to tell me here's the way I think about it, solving this problem, it's going to be intentionally skewed toward their product or service.
Yeah, 100%. And also, by the way, if you think about who he's up against in cloud computing, right? It's like if I asked you to name 10 cloud companies, Expedient, no offense to Brian, probably wouldn't be on your list, but I bet we could all guess the top 4 or 5, right? These are massive companies he's up against with incredible brand power, incredible sales force, all well supported. And so what's his play, right? How is he going to show up in a different sort of way? And what Brian's bet on is humanity. And I respect him for it, deeply, because it's like, not to say I should be careful. It feels like I may have just called his competitors inhuman. I didn't mean to, but but at least for now, that is point of differentiation is I'm just going to try and help you make a great decision. And that's not how most companies are showing up today.
And that's led to pretty impressive growth at Expedient, isn't it?
It has. Absolutely. Yeah. Got him a promotion too.
I grew up in Pittsburgh. I didn't know there was a cloud services company based partly in Pittsburgh.
Well, I tell you, I lose track of, I think it's Columbus is the actual headquarters. They made me go out and do their sales kickoff. They invited me, I should say. The only reason I said made is because I'm a University of Michigan graduate. And so not only did I have to go to Columbus, the home of the Ohio State University, to do this presentation, but literally the room had gray and red furniture. It was just the worst, but I forgive them.
Did they make you put the emphasis on the Ohio?
This is the Framemaking Sale. That's awesome.
About frame making. So what haven't I asked you about frame making that I should have asked you, especially as it relates to thought leadership research, what the marketing folks do to try to get clients to read some hopefully good piece of research,
In the questions you sent over, Bob, there's a really interesting question. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but you asked a question about what I would effectively call the burden of proof. And your point is, if I'm a vendor, a supplier, and I'm providing a framework, how am I not automatically perceived as skewed, as biased? Biased is probably the right word. Like, of course you're telling me to do that, right? And to some degree, I think that's always going to be true. But I think there's things that one can do, and important things that one can do, to make one's advice or framing seem more objective. And by far, the single most important point is social proof, right? This goes all the way back to Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, and this idea of that customers want to know, people want to know, what do other people like me do? Companies want to know, what do other companies like us do? And so, in the thought leadership world, this turns into things like sample size. Like, we've actually surveyed 100 companies. You can cut it, but it turns out, 90% of them are exactly like you. But it's not about, the reason I say this is because I'd love for your audience not just to lean into things like sample size, but lean into, it's more of a qualitative point than a quantitative point, right? Which is, as you think about the evidence that you bring to bear for your framing, it isn't based on your expertise, it's based on your access. And we talk a lot about this in the book, right? Which is the power of your value doesn't come from your knowledge and the fact you've been doing this for years, or as a company you have, all this expertise and more PhDs or patent holders on your team than anyone else. It comes from the fact that you have access to hundreds, if not thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of other companies like that company, and that your abilities to aggregate, synthesize, and put a narrative around something that isn't your thinking, but their experience. And I think the more that you can position your thought leadership as a connecting, what we call a connector role, because in thought leadership, we all want to be the authority. That's the whole point. I want to demonstrate how smart I am. But if you think of thought leadership as a way to demonstrate your access as opposed to your expertise, I'm going to say this as if I actually had a bar chart. I don't. You're going to find a 10x improvement in your thought leadership. I think you will find your thought leadership resonates so much more strongly with your audience when it's perceived as thought leadership coming from a point of access rather than expertise. And that's going to be very counterintuitive to your audience.
I agree with that 100%. Michael Hammer, God rest his soul, he's been gone since 2008, the guru of business reengineering. He would tell us at the firm I worked at, and he would tell reporters, the question would be, Mike, when did you invent business reengineering? And he would say, I didn't invent it. I discovered it. I discovered it by doing case study research with hundreds of companies and found that the best ones did this and the worst ones did that. And here's the difference between the best and the worst.
And see, Bob, what's at the heart of that, for at least me as a Midwestern American, and Karl's at St. Louis, he's a Midwestern like me, there's a humility in that statement. Do you see what I'm saying? As opposed to a swagger. And at the end of the day, the swagger's kind of implied, like, hey, look, I did all this work, and but at the heart of it is like, I'm with you, Bob. I'm on this learning journey. I went out and did all this research. Yes, and it was a lot of hard work, but crazy what I found. Look at this. You come with me on this learning journey, as opposed to you need to do what I tell you. It's so subtle, but this goes back to where I started this conversation around narrative construction and word choice. I think this is the overlooked part in a lot of thought leaders. They don't think like, and no disrespect at all. We're so focused on the content, but the delivery of that content is so important for swaying or bending the way people feel, and not just changing what they know. And I think that's when you become Darth Vader. No, he's bad. That's when you become a Jedi Knight. That's a good one, right? Right, Karl? I think that's a good one. Yeah.
I think so, yeah, Brent. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
Michael Hammer, every time he gave a public presentation, he wouldn't start with, well, re-engineering, here's what it's about, here's why you should do it. He would start with 3 or 4 real case examples. He didn't even use the word re-engineer. He would go through the story of Ford and then Mutual Benefit Life and then IBM Credit, and he would tell you their stories of how they made quantum improvements in quality, cycle time, cost.
Social proof. Start with your access. Yeah.
Yeah, before he said one word about re-engineering. So you go 20 minutes through this presentation, and you're not sure where this guy is going, but you are riveted by these examples. The audience is probably sitting there thinking, I want some of this. I want 5 pounds of this. Whatever he's going to tell us is the common thread here. I want it. So now, Mike, tell us what the answer is.
And what's interesting about this, Bob, you just summed up Karl and my relationship over years and years. Like on the research side, so the people who created the content, they're probably sitting in the back of the room saying, why is he wasting everybody's time with this? Can we just get on with the finding, right? That's what we call the B, the way you want your customers to think. And what he was doing was he was engaged in what we call breaking down the A. This is actually a concept we introduced in the Challenger Customer book, but we actually, Karl and I believe in it so much, we named our company after this. We called it A2B Insight. And this whole idea is like, you got to take what you're currently doing and break it down and show what's not working before you build up the B of what could be working. And again, there's a narrative structure, but I think a lot of us thought leadership's run to, let me show you this cool idea, this cool thing that works. And it's like, but I don't have any context for why that matters yet. And that's exactly what he was doing. But I'm sure the researchers sat in the back of the room and said, would he just get on with the engineering? Because that's what we're here.
Yeah, we know.
Karl's nodding. Look at Karl nod at me. He's like, yeah.
It's true. I mean, we would like each of these big studies we would do, I'd often have, significant sized teams. I mean, at peak, I think we had 50 plus people working on this stuff that would be studying these critical questions for a CXO, whether it was the head of marketing, head of sales, whomever, head of comms, R&D, whatever it might be. And we'd been studying this for, 8 months, generally would be how long these studies would go on for. And then Brent would be involved throughout, or whoever our headliner was for the particular study. But then it was really that final mile was so critical where then Brent would come in and then create the storytelling, create the narrative to really get the audience to really embrace and be able to construct these ideas for themselves. And that's where we need to earn the attention, right? And that's where so much of the challenge, whatever type of outbound messaging we're doing, be it thought leadership, whatever form, how do we earn that audience's attention in today's world with so much information that, all seems good enough. It all seems to be clearing some bar of quality. And that's where, Brent in particular he's so gifted at, again, crafting the story in a way that pulls the audience in, again, using these social proof elements of how do you help people really appreciate this? Oh, I recognize this. I've been the star of this show, right? I've been down this path. Yeah. And that sucked. That did not go well, right? And so of the many things Brent's so well known for and so great at, so much of those audiences would come back and experience this research year after year. It was like, oh, I get what you're doing here, Brent. This is where you're hitting us with the rational drowning. So you really feel the pain of what it is we're experiencing before we start to reveal the solution, right? But that's the key that for anyone listening that's really focused on how to win the audience's attention, there is an aspect of, Brent, how would you say it? Bring in the pain? How would you describe that?
Yeah, you got to take them to the dark place, right? You got to bring the pain. Yeah, I did a meeting, Karl, I don't think you've ever heard this story. I did a meeting once for a small group of really smart heads of sales, Bob, and we were going through the research and it followed the same pattern. And we got to this page and it was one of these pain pages. And I asked the heads of sales, you want to share a story? I imagine this looks pretty familiar. You want to share a story of how you guys were thinking about this? Kevin was there as head of sales, who's now retired, smart guy. He says, Brent, I'm not saying a word because I know whatever I say, you're going to take me behind the shed and completely tell me I'm wrong on the next page. So I'm just going to sit here and quietly wait. so after a while, they kind of saw through me. But again, at the high level, beyond sort of pleased by the book and find ways to apply Framemaking to your world, I think your audience will find it super, super interesting and hopefully relevant. I would say another higher takeaway from this, Bob, is in the world of thought leadership, narrative construct is as important as the content of your thinking.
Absolutely. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Tell me where you guys are going with A2B Insights, and you're building the next CEB, next $1 billion research firm or research and consulting firm.
Right now, of course, we're there's so many big ideas. And the reason why Brent convinced me to come on this journey is I just see the potential for this to help so many people in different contexts. So that's why we wrote it as a book. Books are certainly not the way to get rich about it. You're also an author, so that's not really, you're not in it for the money. Hopefully we're able to help people. Now, some of that help has to go beyond what's in the book. And so that's where the keynotes and workshops come in. And so we're doing quite a lot of that for companies that are early adopters. But ultimately, where A2B is headed is, again, to get back into developing that next generation of research, create that research engine again. Because underlying this question of decision confidence, that there's some fundamental longitudinal data that are really important for us to start collecting that we don't have access to yet. And so in order to, again, fund that, because as you know, doing that primary research is expensive and requires a lot of real specific expertise that, again, people we want to get the band back together, if you will. So there are aspects of that we're absolutely excited about getting after as well. But right now, our focus is how we can help as many people as possible with this. And that's largely going to be these types of workshops and other fairly hands-on involvement where we work with individual companies, figuring out, well, what do their customers need? Where are they struggling? And how can we help them? And what type of framing do we have to establish to help make that complexity a little bit more manageable?
For dealing with here and now problems for these companies to break through it, like Expedient, like how do we break through this big mass of huge cloud computing companies, AWS, IBM, Google? How do we break through this clutter?
There's a whole nother podcast. You and I got into this last time about how we collaborate and how we interact. And there's a lot of, Karl and I debate a lot. We, if you will, argue a lot, but always with the intention of arguing around an idea, not with each other personally, because that keeps it productive. But the thing that we absolutely agree on is why I think we're so aligned is, you mentioned, is it the next billion-dollar company? No. I think the answer is, I'm too old. I don't think we have enough runway for that. There's not enough time. But we don't measure our success in terms of dollars, although that matters. I got 2 kids in college, but we measure it in terms of impact. And if that sounds at all sort of silly, I don't mean it to be. We're all here for a limited amount of time. And when that time comes, I think all of us will want to look back and say, we did something meaningful, and hopefully, certainly with our families and our loved ones and the people around us. But the more you can look at that and say with scale that the things I put into this world had a positive impact, there's nothing more motivating to us. That's what the book's really about, is not only to, hopefully the book will do that, but hopefully the book will equip others to do that. This book it's humanism brought to sales in so many ways. And hopefully people won't reject that, because I think it's so powerfully important.
I love that impact rather than, money.
Yeah.
We just played this clip from Dave Ulrich. Dave, he's University of Michigan. He was a professor there for many years of HR, human resource management. Brilliant guy, like the CHRO guru. And a couple of years ago on our podcast, he said, I care much more about impact than monetizing my IP. I want to know my stuff is having impact.
At the end of the day, you can't take it with you. So it's a question of what do you leave behind, right? And that's how you quantify what you leave behind, I think.
Well, guys, this has been very informative, and your book is great. I recommend it to all of
Thank you.
everybody in our audience, and I think you will go on to do great things and have great impact. And the book is going to be on sale, right, next month?
September 9th. For those in Europe, we've been told it's like you can order it on September 9th and it'll get a delivery date of October 1, which is creating some frustration. That's not on us, but there are some supply chain things there. But we'll do everything we can to get a copy, help the publisher get copies to everyone as quickly as possible.
And the audience can find more about your firm at your website.
Yeah, A2Binsight.com. And one of my projects for the next 5 days, and Karl's been on this work with Divide and Conquer, but the FramemakingsSale.com should be up and live within the next, let's call it 2 weeks, by September 9th. It's 90% done now. So actually the best way to find us, and certainly me, is on LinkedIn. I'm very active there and do a lot of posting there, and certainly feel free to reach out and connect.
Thank you guys for this great conversation.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having us.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a like and if you shared the episode with your colleagues. Everything Thought Leadership is a video and podcast series from Boudet TLP. It's for thought leaders and thought leadership professionals, the people who help experts get recognized as thought leaders. You can find out more about Boudet Thought Leadership Partners at boudettlp.com.